If you believe that the most powerful moments in life are the ones nobody planned for, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe right now. Because what you are about to hear did not come from a script, did not come from a producer's briefing, and did not come from anyone's idea of good television. It came from a woman standing at a microphone who simply told the truth. And the truth she told was so unexpected, so quietly enormous, that it stopped Steve Harvey mid-sentence, turned a game show stage into something that felt like a confessional, and left every person in that studio, and millions watching at home, completely still. Steve Harvey has been in the entertainment business for over 3 decades. He has interviewed presidents, headlined arenas, and hosted one of the most watched game shows on American television for more than a decade. He is not a man who freezes. He is constitutionally incapable of not having something to say. His instinct in every situation, comedy, conflict, awkwardness, grief, is to move toward it to find the words to fill the space. So when Steve Harvey goes silent, when the words stop and the expression on his face becomes something unreadable and the room simply waits, you know that something genuinely extraordinary has just happened. This is the story of Gloria and Walter Sims. Married for 31 years, parents of 4. A couple from Birmingham, Alabama, who came to the Family Feud stage expecting an afternoon of fun and walked away having shared something that neither of them fully expected to share. It started with a game show question, the simplest kind, the kind with a clear answer and a buzzer and a scoreboard. And it ended with a moment that Steve Harvey would later describe as one of the most important things he had ever witnessed on that stage. Gloria Sims was 58 years old. She had been born and raised in Birmingham, the daughter of a Baptist minister and a schoolteacher in a household where Sunday mornings were sacred. Education was non-negotiable, and the idea of giving up on something simply because it was hard was treated as a moral failing. She had internalized all 3 of those values completely. She was the kind of woman who finished things. Projects, promises, relationships, arguments, she did not leave things half done. There was a completeness to everything she undertook that people noticed even when they could not name it. She had worked for 30 years as a licensed social worker, specializing in family crisis intervention. Her caseload had always been heavy, too heavy, her supervisors would say, and Gloria would listen politely and then take on one more family anyway. She had sat with parents who had lost children and children who had lost parents. She had brokered agreements between people who had stopped believing agreement was possible. She had driven to hospital emergency rooms at 2 in the morning and to courthouses at 7 in the morning, and had held the hands of people at every point in between. She had, by her own quiet accounting, given the largest portion of her professional life to other people's worst days. What her colleagues knew, what her family knew, and what she herself had only recently begun to say out loud was that 30 years of absorbing other people's crisis had left marks. Not visible ones, not the kind that show up in a medical chart or interrupt a workday, but the slower, subtler kind, the accumulated weight of 30 years of sitting inside grief that was never hers to keep but always hers to carry home. She had been in therapy for 6 years. She managed well. But she had learned, gradually and not without resistance, that managing well was not the same as being unaffected. Walter Sims was 61 years old. He had spent his career as a mechanical engineer for a large manufacturing firm in Birmingham, a methodical, exacting man who understood systems and took genuine satisfaction in making them work correctly. He was quieter than Gloria in most rooms, content to let her lead the social dimensions of their shared life, while he handled what he thought of as the structural ones, the finances, the house maintenance, the logistics of a family of 6. He was not an unfeeling man. He was simply a man whose feelings operated below the surface, dependable and constant, and not particularly interested in being discussed. The couple had 4 children, Denise, 30, Andre, 27, Keisha, 24, and Marcus, 20, who was still in college. All 4 had grown up in the same house in Birmingham's South Side neighborhood, a brick colonial that Walter had meticulously maintained for 28 years. The family had a settled quality to it, the kind that comes not from perfection but from longevity, from having weathered enough together that the weather itself had become familiar. The Family Feud application had been submitted by Keisha, who was studying broadcast journalism and thought the experience would be fun and professionally interesting in equal measure. She had written about her parents in the application with the affectionate accuracy of a daughter who has been paying close attention, describing her father as the kind of man who fixes everything without being asked, and her mother as the kind of woman who knows what you need before you know it yourself. The producers had liked the family immediately. Gloria had been genuinely excited about the taping. She had watched Family Feud for years and had a particular appreciation for Steve Harvey, whose ability to hold a room with warmth and intelligence she recognized as a genuine skill. She wore a coral-colored dress and had done her hair the way she did for church, carefully, with intention. Walter wore a dark gray suit and looked, as he always did in formal settings, like a man who would be more comfortable in his workshop, but was present and willing. Neither of them arrived at the studio expecting the day to become what it became. But then, the days that change things rarely announce themselves in advance. The Sims family played against the Washington family from Detroit, Michigan. From the opening round, the dynamic was clear. The Washington family was loud, fast, and operating as a single high-energy unit. The Sims family was steadier, more deliberate, less electric, but surprisingly effective in ways that the scoreboard gradually confirmed. Gloria was particularly strong, stepping to the podium with the calm of someone accustomed to thinking clearly under pressure and delivering answers that landed with quiet authority. Steve Harvey had taken to Gloria immediately. There was something in her demeanor, the combination of warmth and precision, the sense that she was fully present in a way that many contestants are not, that made him return to her between rounds more than the format strictly required. He asked about her work, her family, the decades she had spent in social services. She answered everything directly and without embellishment, which was its own form of charisma. The Sims family went into the final round trailing by a narrow margin. The tension was real but manageable, the kind of competitive pressure that the show is built on, the kind that produces good television precisely because the outcome is genuinely uncertain. Steve worked the room between questions, keeping the energy alive, circling back to both families with the practiced ease of someone who knows exactly how much the pacing of a moment matters. It was during one of these between-question exchanges that Steve turned to Gloria and asked, with the casual warmth he brings to all such moments, a question he had asked thousands of contestants in some variation over the years. Gloria, after 30 years as a social worker working with families in crisis, sitting with people on their worst days, what is the one thing that has stayed with you? What is the one thing you carry? It was the kind of question designed to produce a gracious, quotable answer. Something about resilience, something about the human capacity for survival, something that would give the audience a moment of uplift and let the game move forward. Gloria was quiet for 3 full seconds. In the tempo of a live game show, 3 seconds is a noticeable pause. Steve registered it. The audience registered it. Walter, standing beside her, turned his head slightly to look at his wife. And then Gloria Sims said, "Honestly, I carry the ones I couldn't help. I carry the families I sat with and still couldn't save. I carry the children I reported and the ones I didn't report fast enough. I carry a boy named Darius who was 9 years old and who I think about every single day and who I will think about every day for the rest of my life." She did not cry. Her voice did not break. She said it the way she must have said it to her therapist, fully, without apology, with the particular steadiness of a person who has already done the work of surviving the saying of it. Steve Harvey did not move. He stood perfectly still, his hands at his sides, his expression, usually so mobile, so ready with the next word or the next turn, completely arrested. He looked at Gloria for a long moment, and the audience, reading him, went completely quiet. The production crew, visible at the edges of the shot, had stopped moving. Even the Washington family on the other side of the stage had stilled. Walter reached out and placed his hand on the small of Gloria's back. Just that. Just his hand, steady and quiet, in the place where it had rested 1,000 times before, and the studio held its breath. Steve Harvey blinked. He exhaled slowly. And when he spoke, his voice was entirely different from the voice he used to host the show, lower, slower, stripped of its performative energy, carrying instead the register of a man who has been genuinely moved and has decided not to pretend otherwise. "Can I ask you about Darius?" The simplicity of the question, not a pivot, not a recovery, not an attempt to steer the moment back toward manageable television, was itself remarkable. Steve was not redirecting. He was leaning in. He was asking because he wanted to know, and the audience could feel the difference. Gloria looked at him. "Darius was a 9-year-old boy on my caseload about 14 years ago," she said. "He was in a difficult home situation. I was doing everything the system allowed me to do, following every protocol, filing every report. And then one morning I got a call that told me it hadn't been enough." She paused. "He survived. He is alive. I found out several years later that he had been placed with a foster family and was doing well, but for a long time I didn't know that. And in the years when I didn't know, I went over every decision I had made, every single one." "Do you still go over them?" Steve asked. "Not the way I used to," Gloria said. "Therapy helped, time helped, but I think there are some things you are supposed to carry, not out of guilt, just out of," she searched for the right word, "respect. You carry them because they deserve to be carried. because forgetting would be worse. Steve was quiet for another moment. Then he turned to face the audience, not theatrically, but as though including them in something he wanted to say in front of witnesses. I have talked to a lot of people on this stage. A lot of people have told me about their lives, their struggles, their families, and I can count on one hand the moments where someone said something that changed the way I was going to think about a thing. This is one of those moments. He looked back at Gloria. You just described something that I think a lot of people in this audience and a lot of people watching at home have never heard named. The weight that comes not from failing, but from doing everything right and still not being able to stop something from happening. And you said that weight is not something you put down. You carry it out of respect. You carry it because they deserve to be carried. He paused. That is one of the most profound things I have ever heard on this stage. And I want you to know, I want everyone in this room to know that the work you have done for 30 years, the families you sat with, the ones you got through and the ones you didn't, that work matters. It has mattered every single day. And the fact that you still feel the weight of it is not a sign that you failed. It is a sign of exactly how seriously you took every single person who ever needed you. Gloria pressed her lips together. For the first time in the exchange, her composure showed its edges not breaking, but bending slightly, the way something strong does when it is finally permitted to acknowledge its own weight. "Thank you," she said. She said it simply, without elaboration, in the way people say thank you when they mean it completely. Walter, standing beside her, had not spoken. He was not a man for whom public words came easily, and the room seemed to understand that. But he had not removed his hand from the small of his wife's back. And when Steve glanced at him, a brief, acknowledging look man to man, Walter gave a small nod that contained, in its compression, everything he might have said if the words had been available to him. Steve turned to the audience one final time. This woman has spent 30 years showing up for other people's worst days. She has never been on a stage like this. Nobody has ever stood here in front of a camera and said, "This is what it costs. This is what the work actually costs, and I carry it, and I carry it with respect." He shook his head slowly. That is what service looks like, real service, not the kind that gets applause, the kind that gets done in the dark every day whether anyone is watching or not. The applause that followed was long and full and entirely unperformed. People were standing before it finished. The Sims family won that episode, though in the days and weeks that followed, very few people who discussed it could recall the final score. The game had become, somewhere in the middle of that exchange between Steve Harvey and Gloria Sims, entirely secondary to what the episode had actually been about. When the Sims family left the studio that afternoon, the production staff, a group of people accustomed to memorable moments and professionally trained not to show it, formed an informal line to shake Gloria's hand on the way out. The episode aired 7 weeks later. By the end of the broadcast day, the clip of Steve Harvey's exchange with Gloria had been viewed more than 18 million times. By the end of the week, it had crossed 40 million. It was shared by social workers, by nurses, by teachers, by emergency responders, by therapists, by every category of person who spends their professional life inside other people's difficulty and rarely, if ever, hears anyone acknowledge what that costs. The comment sections beneath the clip were unlike anything the show's social media team had previously encountered. Not the usual mix of reactions and jokes, but page after page of people writing, often for what appeared to be the first time publicly, about the weight they carried from work nobody fully saw. The National Association of Social Workers issued a formal statement 3 days after the episode aired. It noted that Gloria Sims had articulated, in less than 2 minutes of unscripted television, something that the profession had struggled to communicate to the public for decades. That vicarious trauma is real, that the people who absorb the suffering of others do not leave it at the office, and that the moral weight of impossible situations, situations where everything correct was done, and the outcome was still painful, is a specific and largely unacknowledged form of professional injury. The statement was shared widely within the field and cited in several subsequent academic discussions about workforce well-being in social services. Gloria gave a single interview in the weeks following the broadcast to a publication that focused on social work and mental health. She was characteristically precise about what she wanted the conversation to be and what she did not want it to be. She did not want it to be about her specifically. She wanted it to be about the thousands of social workers, nurses, teachers, and crisis responders who were carrying the same weight she had named on that stage and had never been offered a public language for it. "I didn't say anything extraordinary," she told the interviewer. "I said something true. The reason people responded the way they did is because it had not been said out loud in that kind of space before. That says more about what we are missing in our public conversation than it says about me." She also spoke briefly about Darius. She had reached out to his former foster family after he turned 18 through channels that her professional network made available to her. She had learned that he had graduated from high school, was working, and was by all accounts doing well. She had not contacted him directly, that was his choice to make, not hers, but knowing he was all right had given her something she had not expected. Not closure exactly, but permission to carry him differently. Less like a wound, and more like a responsibility that had been, at least in part, met. Walter Sims gave no interviews and made no public statements, which was entirely consistent with who he was. What his children reported in the months following the broadcast was that something had shifted at home, not dramatically, not in ways that rewrote the family's daily life, but in the quiet ways that matter most. Walter had started asking Gloria at the end of the day a question he had not consistently asked before. Not how was work, which invites a summary, but what was hard today, which invites the truth. It was a small adjustment. It was also, by Gloria's account, the most important thing he had ever done. Keisha Sims, whose broadcast journalism studies had led her to submit the original application, wrote a piece for her university newspaper about the experience that received national attention and was ultimately published in an expanded form by a major media outlet. She wrote about watching her mother answer Steve Harvey's question, about the 3 seconds of silence before the answer came, and about realizing in that moment that she had grown up in a house with a woman she had never fully seen. "I knew my mother was strong," she wrote. "I did not understand until that afternoon what the strength was for. I did not understand what it was holding up." Steve Harvey spoke about the exchange during a podcast interview several months after the episode aired. He said, "I have a job where I am supposed to keep things moving. That is what a host does. You keep the energy going. You never let it get too heavy. You bring it back when it starts to drift." And then Gloria Sims stood there and said what she said, and I understood immediately that the only right thing to do was to stop moving, to just stop, because what she was saying was more important than anything I was going to say next. And that is a feeling I have learned to trust. When something is more important than what I have to say next, I need to be quiet and let it be what it is. The clip of Steve Harvey freezing, that 2 to 3 second window where the most fluent man in the room simply had no words, became, in the months that followed, something of a cultural shorthand. It was referenced in discussions about active listening, about the difference between hearing and receiving, about the particular kind of respect that is expressed not through response but through stillness. Several management training programs incorporated it as an example of what genuine presence looks like in a professional context. It was, in its own quiet way, as instructive as anything Steve Harvey had ever said. Gloria Sims returned to work the Monday after the taping. She took on no new cases that week, on the advice of her therapist, who felt she deserved a few days of lighter load after the emotional exposure of the broadcast. By the following Monday, she was back at full capacity. She has not given any additional interviews. She continues to work, continues to see her therapist monthly, and continues to carry, with respect, with intention, and without apology, the people who deserve to be carried. If this story stayed with you, if you believe that the people who show up for others in the dark deserve to be seen in the light, please give this video a like and subscribe. Every week we bring you stories that remind us what real strength actually looks like and what it quietly costs. We will see you in the next one.